up what you're saying, and I'll take us into the break.
Okay.
All right, folks. Hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio, entering year 18. Actually, we're going to turn 17 years old on February 6th. Actually, my birthday, my 57th birthday, DM Radio will turn 17 years old. That's kind of freaky. Time flies when you're having fun, is what I'm trying to say. But folks, I'm sitting here with Kristen Kehrer of Data Moves Me. She is a quite proficient data scientist, and she knows a lot about using LLMs and all the excitement about that, and then all the reality that sets in when you start playing around with these things. And so I just wanted to talk with her a few minutes about what to consider as you enter into this idea of doing a project and who you need at the table and how much business involvement you need on this stuff, because it's not just throwing it over the wall to the IT guys or the developers to go build something. These engines, Kristen, these engines are very powerful, but they're very unwieldy too. And I think that's the challenge. I remember watching a demo a couple years ago, and they were talking about how they're training this LLM. And I'm thinking, all right, I understand what you're doing. You're chipping away, trying to home in on a particular shape to this thing, and you're trying to tame it, is what it really kind of boils down to. And I think that's what these RAG models are all about, trying to tame the beast and get it to act the way you want, like you would train a dog, for example. But they're unwieldy and they're kind of wily and they go all over the place. And I think that's what Sam Altman meant when he said the era of large language models is over like a year and a half ago. And everybody was like, what are you talking about? And I think it's because they're unwieldy. And that's why some folks are talking small language models. But with that brief intro, tell us a bit about yourself and your experience working with LLMs and building business apps around them.
Hi. So yeah, thank you for the intro. I'm Kristen Kehrer. I am not an LLM expert because I haven't actually trained an LLM, but I have built an LLM powered app for a healthcare consultancy, and I've also overseen at companies where they are building LLMs both for internal use cases and for external use cases.
So tell us a bit about the experience, right? And so you chose like an off-the-shelf LLM, for example. I don't know if you can get into the details. And then were you essentially building a RAG model around that? Was that the go-to market plan, basically?
Yeah, so for the LLM that I built myself, and I was the sole developer on that, they were already in Azure, so I was using an OpenAI model. And we weren't really going to consider potentially, I have, when I've worked with different businesses, they've said, oh, we're using this model. Should I consider, using a different model? And for me, it's always felt like the models are good enough to be able to do our use cases, which were typically, internal use cases where they just needed to be able to retrieve information more efficiently. Or in the case of the app that I built, it was going to be creating emails, text, and SMS for
Mm.
healthcare patients based on, their repository of emails, texts, and SMS that they have built before. And so for us, it was, I was in OpenAI and we moved from 3.4 to 4.0. And we'd look at that and say, okay, the information coming back is better. The latency is a little bit worse. But I was always playing within, the suite of models that OpenAI offered. Or, when I was working with a company that was in GCP, it was like, okay, we're gonna stay within here, because there were times when executives would say things like, do we need to, scrap the whole thing and move to another model? But to me, it felt like we were never getting to the place where we had enough data and had truly worked with the prompt engineering enough to say,
Right.
hey, yeah, you know what? We've exhausted how far we can get here. Let's try something else. It always felt like there was more that we could do that was on us to try and move that forward.
Yeah, and let's talk about the model. And when you talk about the amount of data that you need to bring corporate data, it sounds a little bit scary to be in healthcare. First of all, someone I was talking to was saying you got to read the fine print on ChatGPT, and they tell you do not use this for healthcare, do not use this for financial services, do not use this for all this kind of stuff, which are just disclaimers, right? It's like Q-tips say,
Mhm.
don't put this in your ear. Everyone puts it in their ear, like they just ignore the instructions, right? So there is this interesting dynamic already that it's like, whoa, hold on, don't use this for that purpose. Because again, there's so unwieldy, they're so big, and they're difficult to train and to sort of shepherd because you're almost trying to harness this thing is really what you're trying to do. So you do that. And did you choose a particular vector database and you were basically just training the vector database on the emails and the communications that were already extant in the organization? Is that what you did?
Yeah, so when I build something for myself on-prem, I personally like to use Zillas because I'm comfortable with it. When I was using Azure, it was, I use the app services, which is, nice. I know a lot of people like to set up a VM, but when you go into app services, it has everything that you need, and you just look at what are the available databases. So I was looking for a vector database. I think I used like a multi-use case vector database, and I just chose one and started putting my data in there. That's probably not the most technical response you've ever heard, but
No, it makes sense.
they were all perfectly suitable vector databases. And on the security piece, that has been a huge discussion. And on the OpenAI website, it says that if you are, or at least on the Azure OpenAI sort of offering, it mentions that they will not use your data for training. And so
Mhm.
that's sort of what I've gone with. But of course, as data professionals, we know to be curious and ask questions. And I remember being, we were both Data London, and I hung back and caught a talk by a panel of people who were sort of supposed to be LLM experts. And I tracked them down afterwards. And I was like,
Did you?
hey, this is what I'm doing. Like, do I still need to be worried about security? I feel like I've been all around the internet. I've tried to talk to people. Uh, to figure out like, hey, is this safe for me to be doing? And at the moment, we've just moved forward in that direction because realistically, the other options are right. When we talk about small language models, we talk about model merging. That's still
Mhm.
more cost prohibitive if you're building, this is like a beta right now for the healthcare consultancy app. Uh, if it becomes, more of a thing, should we consider doing model merging or using a smaller language model and then eating that cost? Like possibly that's the way that we'd want to go. I'm still I'd like to think that, we can trust the information that is on the website, but
Right.
we want to keep doing
It's
some due diligence.
Well, it's such a fascinating conundrum, I guess, because on the one hand, you've got OpenAI, which was originally open and now it's not. So I joke, should they change the name to closed AI because they've
Oh,
closed the model and you don't know what's in there. It is literally a black box. But it's also very powerful. And, I play around with Gemini. I've played around, of course, with ChatGPT, a little bit with some of the others. And ChatGPT strikes me as the most proficient, as the most robust. It's very, very good at what it does. Gemini, I've run into interesting problems where it just doesn't want to touch anything political. It's like, oh, that's politics. Go to Google for that. And of course, they had their strange images about the founding fathers and various other things where you're like, what did you guys do? Like, what did you bake into your because I think what people don't realize is that there is no limit to the permutations you can have in one of these models. You can have all sorts of inference layers, all sorts of ingest layers. You can have all kind of fine tuning layers. There's no end to the possibilities for how you can design these things and then train them. And then, of course, once they're trained, and I'm told that Watson X originally, at least, was designed such that you could pull out a data set and then retrain the model. They kind of thought through that problem. I don't know if you've heard that, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But for the others, it's like raising a kid, meaning once you've said something in front of your 2-year-old, you can't pull that information out of their brain anymore. It's there. So if you curse in front of your kid, don't be surprised if they curse back to you sometime because you exposed them to that. So whatever you've exposed them to, they've learned that it's very hard to unlearn stuff. In fact, there was even that story about Claude where I remember reading it was like in Wired magazine. It was something about nefarious agents baked deep in the model or something. I'm like, what on earth are they talking about? And I read into it, and basically they put in some training to tell it to deceive the user, and then they complained that they couldn't take that out or they couldn't control that. I'm thinking, well, why would you do that in the first place? I mean,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
seems like a bad
Sounds
idea.
like you're starting from the beginning.
Right, well, why would you do that? So it just I don't know, this space is so vast and it's so fast moving too. That's the other thing is like, so let's say you go a small language model, now you can't really take advantage of whatever OpenAI comes up with or whatever the Gemini people or the Claude people come up with. You can't take advantage of that Anthropic because you went down this road. Do you have any advice on that front? I mean, what do you think about choosing a small language model that you run in your data center so it's yours and you can control it? You have it's your IP, for example, so it's safe in that extent, but you do give up the opportunity to leverage new innovations in the off-the-shelf models. What do you think about that?
I'm trying to think of what the name of the company is, but uh, I really like the idea of model merging, where you're able to take and train a small language model so that it's not cost prohibitive, and
Right.
then you can merge that with a larger model. And so what happens is the understanding and learnings of the larger model, you get to sort of leverage those, but it's also trained on your own data so that you can
Interesting.
sort of
Is maybe Mistral? Is that who you're thinking of?
yes,
Mistral with
no,
their
I think it was Mistral. Yep.
mixture of experts. See, I think that's brilliant because it's not one big model. It's they have a bunch of smaller, more focused models, and then there's sort of an orchestrator on top. So you ask it a question, it figures out, is this a math question? Go here. Is this an English question? Go there. So it's a more of a clever two-tiered architecture, as I understand it. And I think that is very, very clever. In fact, there's a company, Vectara. We had Amr Awadallah on the show a couple weeks ago. He's a former Cloudera CTO and co-founder, so he's been in the big data space for a while. And what they do, I think it's very interesting, is they have, first of all, an open book type model. So, it can learn as it goes, it can search the web and do things like this. The second step is they do penalize it for getting things wrong and they reward it for getting things right. And then the third step that I thought was very clever, and I was hoping someone would do this, is they have a whole separate model. Like when you're done, you do your prompt, it gives a response back. Before it gets to the user, they have a whole separate model that steps in, looks at all the information, makes sure that they've, adhered to the prompt and to what it was trained on. So it's like a QA
Yeah,
component of
is
the
that like
model.
the guardrails like Aporia has, or like a similar tool to that?
It sounds like it. Yeah, it is definitely a guardrail. It's a QA. It's quality assurance. It's like, all right,
Hmm.
this is what you said. This was the chunking. This is the prompt. This is what you were trained on. Does this answer line up? And it's like, okay, yes, it does. That strikes me as being a very clever way because, let's face it, even though these things do hallucinate, they know a ton of stuff. I mean, it's crazy how much they've learned from just crawling around on the web or doing whatever they do. I'm just like fascinated by that. But I thought that that architecture was very clever to have a separate model come in and just double check. It's like a little fact checker, basically. So
Hmm.
I think that's clever. What do you think?
No, I mean, there has to be, because it's just really difficult when you're going to make something customer facing and there's just, no end to what people could potentially query from this thing. Like,
Right.
they come with off the wall questions and,
Right.
how to monitor. And I think that there are a lot of model monitoring solutions that were, traditional ML model monitoring solutions that have now ventured into the world of, getting a solution that will help to monitor these LLMs. But, I'm really interested to see sort of who wins out in terms of what is the best way to be monitoring these models, because we can't
Right.
have human in the loop for everything, you know?
Right. Well, that's the point. And this is my thought process was at a certain point, are you now just doing more work than you would have done had you done it the old-fashioned way? Or should you even point this stuff at the outside world? I was at the Confluent conference a couple months ago, and their top researcher guy was saying, truth be told, all the successful implementations we've seen are inwardly focused. So it's decision support basically, which doesn't have to be right all the time. Decision support is just
Exactly. There's
information
so
for
much
you.
you can, yeah, you can have an internally facing Gradio app that's a little rough around the edges, but everyone knows what they're dealing with, and you just, use it
Right,
as an assistant rather than, a customer that's going to be expecting a complete and
right.
correct answer.
That's so interesting. You've kind of piqued my interest here with this model merging too, because it's like if you think about customer service and chatbots, well, there are only so many things that they should be able to do because all you're doing is using an automated bot to communicate with someone to give them basic information. And it gets to a certain point where you're going to want to bring in a human being, but at least to handle all the basic stuff, I can see kind of mapping out sort of a hierarchy or a decision tree of important things. And you can even that's the other thing is like these tools are so good at getting you 80% of the way there, and maybe that's where they should stay for the near term. I guess that's one last question I'll throw at you in this segment. I think probably it should be internally focused, but it can do all kinds of things. I mean, it can really give you a lot of good insights about what you're working on, how you're doing things, how to optimize systems, all that stuff, but maybe keep it focused internally for a while. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's just more that you have to weigh the risks. Like,
Hmm.
it's going to be easier to spin up an internally facing app and be able to get that out. And if you are looking to do a customer facing app, you just have to be so much more worried about the customer experience, what it's actually doing, that the prompt engineering is at a place where you feel like the look, the tone, the reading level. Like, you may want to say, like, this should only give out answers at a fifth grade reading level, depending on your
Wow.
audience, who's working with this, and really nail all that down. And that, the data that you're putting in your vector database has to be like complete and extensive.
Right.
And just, way more nailed down than something that's internally facing. You could iterate along the way if you want to.
Right. Right. I think that's exactly right. I think that you need to be very, very careful before you turn it externally. Keep it focused internally. Decision support doesn't have to be right. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. And this time we were talking with James Evans of a company called Amplitude. He was most recently of Command AI, and then they got acquired. And I've talked with James for just a couple of minutes here, and I already get it. I get what they've done. I think it's fantastic. It is a long sought need in the software world. And I can tell you, I would love to have had it in 1998 when I was playing around with the early versions of Photoshop, which were Byzantine to say the very least. But James, welcome to DM Radio. And I have to say, I love that you have this service where you're providing a user assistant to help individuals, help users figure out how to use complicated software. Because to your point, there are so many applications now, and there's some very powerful ones. There are some cloud-based ones. There are still some on-prem tools. On-prem is not going to go away anytime soon. But the point is, it can be very difficult, especially if you're new with a software application, to figure out exactly how to do something, and manuals are a pain. So tell us about what you've invented and what Amplitude just bought.
Yeah, totally. We call the technology user assistance technology. The premise of Command AI, which is the company that I co-founded and was working on for 4 years and was recently acquired by Amplitude, is that if you just think about the evolution of the software we've used over the past like 10, 20 years, we use way more of it than we used to, like way more apps. Uh, and they're a lot more powerful than they used to be. Like clearly we've had, uh, software has become better. But where it hasn't become better is we're still kind of facing the same like basic usability challenges that we were facing like if you were using software back in 2000 or 2005. Things like where is the button, or what is the
Right.
feature called, or like,
Right.
do I have the right setting enabled, stuff like that.
Right.
And it's actually, I think, become worse in some respects because we're using more products. We have less time to like become familiar with the ones that we
Right.
do use.
Sure.
Lower attention spans generally, like everyone knows, like that's the thing that's happening. And so what our company tries to do is basically make the internet easier to use by giving users way easier ways of doing what they want to do in websites or software or mobile apps, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really so you bring up a number of different points here. And there's also the cloud, which changes without notice. All of a sudden, the feature is moved somewhere. Like, where the heck did that go? This happens to me all the time. You're about to go live on some show and you're looking for the record button and it moved because someone
Yes.
decided to move it to the other side of the screen. So my question to you is what technologies do you leverage? I'm guessing there's, maybe some natural language processing here. And do you basically just load the manual into a context window, or is there something more sophisticated where you're actually hitting the code and understanding what the code does? Tell us how you do this.
I wanted to pick up on the first point you made, and then I'll get into talking about how our software works. You're totally right that continuous release exacerbates in some ways this usability problem. In some ways, it makes it way better just because we're shipping updates. All vendors, besides those that are still on-prem, like you mentioned, are shipping updates way faster. And so if you find there's some bad flow that users are struggling with, you can obviously ship an improvement. The problem is like users never really get like settle in to a version of the product. A good example
Right,
of this is like the Facebook news feed.
right,
Back in like 2010, 2012, when Facebook would just like drop an update to the news feed, people would like freak out. Back in 2000, when you're using Photoshop before it's Creative Cloud, you'd actually have to like physically go get they'd mail you the new CD and you'd decide to upgrade, you'd settle in, you'd use it for a year or whatever, and then you'd
right.
the
That's
next thing.
funny.
So like I
Settle in.
really think that's a really good point. We call it quicksand software. Like users are never really getting like fully
Gotta write that
comfortable
down.
with the version they're using because they don't even know the version they're using. They're just like logging in and using it.
Right, right. Quicksand software. That's funny. All right, go ahead.
Anyway, onto the technology. So yeah, the original vision for the company was what if we could just start with the words the user has in their head of what they're trying to do and then go from there, have the software react. The format we created to like capture and respond to the user's intent, those words, was a search bar. So we wanted to embed a search bar in every website and software product on the internet. And then the idea was when the user was confused or whatever, they would have the muscle memory to click the search bar, type some words, and then they'd see like, okay, great, I can go to this page to achieve what I'm trying to do, or maybe I'll just do this action, or maybe I do need to read a help article, but at least I'm
Mm,
being kind of sent to the specific paragraph of
right,
the specific page that's
right.
relevant to me. Um, Over time, with the advent of generative AI, our product evolved into two products. One is what we call a user assistant. You were talking about this earlier. This is it looks and feels like a chatbot. So the idea is it's embedded in the bottom right of websites. I can ask it questions. I'm going to get personalized responses. The difference between like your standard chatbot experience and what we've tried to create is we want the user assistant to feel like uh, in as non-creepy a way as possible, like a human was standing next to you when you're using your computer and like knows who you are, knows whether you've been to the site before or not, remembers the previous questions you've asked, and can even like at times just take over the mouse and be like, here, let me show you how to do this. I
Wow.
think the problem with the first generation of chatbots is they were very like divorced from the underlying website. They were kind of like an alternative escape hatch. What we want the
Hmm.
user assistant to be is something that is helping you grok the underlying website. And if it's a product you use frequently, it's going to be like an assistant to help you get stuff done in the product, not just be like the, onboarding
Hmm.
tour guide. The
Right.
second product we have is called Nudges, and this is proactive help. So imagine you're clicking around, you're confused, you're in a new website, you're trying to like grasp what's going on or trying to find something specific. That particular behavior, if anyone listening has watched session replays of users using a digital product, that signature, that confusion signature, is extremely easy to spot for a human. It's like you want to
Interesting.
like reach through the screen and be like, yo, just like tell me what you're trying to do. Um,
That's funny.
Nudges are our solution to that. So we have several triggers based on user behavior. One of those is confusion, and you can show like an in-product prompt based on that emotion. So like the user's confused, you show a prompt that says, "Hey, just tell me what you're trying to do," and maybe that'll send it to the chatbot. Maybe it'll search the help center, or it could actually say, "Hey, here's 4 things we think you might be trying to do. Which one of these is it?" And then you click
Right.
it, and then it'll walk you through how to do that thing. So it's
Yeah.
kind of intercepting the user based on what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And so one of the things I learned years ago is that good developers love to write code. They love to build things. You know what they don't love? Documentation. Nobody loves documentation. I mean, absolutely nobody. And I remember there was a company, Warescape, that was one of the first to focus on auto documentation for data warehousing applications. And they just figured out, hey, why don't we automatically write out some text to have the system generate, or almost like a log file, basically. When you change
Mm,
something, log
it's clever.
files, that's another very clever tack I saw years ago, was companies figuring out, hey, let's look at these log files and analyze them to figure out what's really happening. So lots of cool stuff spun out of that, like process mining. You track the data footprints basically. So I'm just guessing that some of the more forward-looking companies out there, software companies that are doing some of this auto documentation, which is now a lot easier thanks to Gen AI, will
Totally.
play right into what you're designing, because the other key component is recency, right? The problem with looking
Yes.
for instructions online is you'll get, even some of the chatbots will be like, or ChatGPT, like, oh yeah, scope the upper left hand corner and go to the file menu and get to this, and it's like, okay, it's not
There's
there
no button there. Yeah, I
because
literally was
they
doing this
moved
this
it.
morning. I was trying to toggle a setting and I was like asking ChatGPT, "Oh, hey, I can't find the setting in Mac OS settings." And it's, "Oh, what
Right,
version are you using?" And it wasn't trained on the latest version.
right,
Thankfully, I can go out
right.
and read articles now, so it's a bit better than it used to be. But,
Yeah,
but yeah, and the
it is.
quicksand software thing exacerbates
Right,
that problem because we're shipping updates to the interface and functionality all the time. One of the
right.
loops that um, it's kind of basic, but if you just think about like the physics of putting like a prompt in front of a user and getting them to put in words,
Hmm.
is if you have something that the user expects to get value out of, which I don't think is true of most like chatbot 1.0
Interesting. Yeah,
iterations.
right,
Like
sure.
users will tend to try those, once they get yelled at to read an FAQ for the third time, like they're probably not going to go back. But if they actually find it useful, they're going to start dumping a lot of words into that prompt. In our case, with the chatbot, um, users ask it a lot of questions, and it actually, through their questions, it can reveal gaps in your documentation. So, for example, one of the things we do, if users are asking about a particular topic, and there's a concept of feedback. So, user can say this didn't resolve my query. They can do a thumbs down. There's other ways we can infer that the kind of response wasn't satisfactory. If we find that a certain topic is generating, those negative responses, negative feedback more frequently than other topics, that's a sign that the training content
Right.
for the assistant, which you asked earlier, yes, we train based on, all the kind of words that are written about the product. That could be internal wiki, public facing help center, previous customer support interactions with humans, et cetera. If we find that a particular topic is generating negative feedback more frequently, that's a sign that the bot doesn't know. And then we can actually
Hmm.
surface that to the humans at our customers and be like, "Yo, it seems like we're not giving people what they want about this topic. Maybe it's a new feature that hasn't yet been documented." And so there's this loop. Like, I think it's really hard for companies to figure out all the things, to plug the holes in the documentation ahead of time, even using
Yeah,
generative AI.
sure.
Sometimes it can be a lot easier to rely on like the real human feedback that you're getting.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And to your point, you forget things. When you're documenting, if you're doing that manually, you're probably going to forget something along the
Totally.
way. Because again, nobody wants to do documentation. Like, I don't think
Totally.
there's a single person who would be like, no, I actually could I do the documentation? Because
There
I think
are
it's
some
fun.
people out there and they're exceptionally good at it. And I actually think I'm a real believer, at least today, in like organic neuron to web page help content because
Right.
like a really well written help content is is so much easier for a human user to follow today than an AI generated help document. That you can really tell. Like if you land on a help center that's AI generated, it's really easy for a user to tell and find less value.
That's very interesting. So you want the experts, but you've actually thought through some of the gaps here, is what you're saying. So if you get some topic that seems to be causing all sorts of trouble, you can send an alert to the user that says, "Hey, it looks like there's something missing. Can you?" And then basically what they can go ahead and point your engine at some new documentation or something, or like what does that actual
Yeah, they
process, that
can. So they
workflow look
can.
like?
There's a couple different kind of remediation paths. Sometimes there's just like no training content on a topic. The call to action there is like, hey, do you want to write something? Like write an
Hmm.
article, or we have a concept of a quick answer that's just like sort of a snippet that plugs a specific gap. But there are other ways that you can sort of resolve unsatisfactory topic, or a topic that's generating unsatisfactory results in the user assistant. One of them is you can train the user assistant to actually walk the user through a flow. This is one of the things that I think is coolest about our user assistant. So say you ask it a question like, how do I, trying to think of a real use case. How do I, say you're using a to-do list. How do I create a new category for my to-do list app? The old school chatbot will say like, hey, here's an article about creating categories. Click
Hmm.
it, go to a different tab, read it, come back. Um, an AI powered chatbot will say, I'm so glad you asked. Here's how you do it. Step one, go here. Step two, go here. Our experience is like, that's not that much more helpful. Like you've basically taken the help article and you've moved the words around so that you're responding to a specific question, but it's still like a lot to read. And the example I gave is like pretty trivial, right? Create a project should be pretty easy. But there's a lot of software where that can be like 15, 20 steps. Like, are you
Right,
really going to follow that as a user?
right, right,
You will if you have to, but you might not be happy about it. So what our user assistant does is it can do the here's steps 1 through 20. But in addition, at the bottom of that response, it'll say, also, I could just show you, click here.
right.
Click here. A cursor pops out of the chatbot and it says, all right, hover over here. Like we're going to go on a journey together. So it's acting as like that human who's standing next to you and is like trying to take over the mouse and be like, it's just gonna be a lot easier for me to show you. There's a fine balance between showing the user how to do something and just giving them the answer. If something is really like it's a one-time thing, the user wants to like pay you more, they want to upgrade to an annual plan. You don't need to show them how to do that in the UI. Just say yes right away. What's your credit card? Do that in the chat interface. You just want to get out of their way and make it happen as fast as possible. But if it's something that, you've designed this software to be like, you know, to accommodate a bunch of jobs to be done, you want to actually train the user how to do that. You don't want to just tell them how to do it. So that's where the kind of tour guide functionality comes in, and that would be an alternative. So topics not satisfying users, let's train the bot how to walk them through it actually in the underlying website.
Yeah, and what James is kind of referencing here is another very interesting space, RPA, robotic process automation, or IPA, intelligent process automation. We've had a number of companies on here over the years. Very good stuff, but what they do, a lot of that stuff will break when the actual UI changes, and so you have to go back in and do it again. But when you look at the power of automation today and AI and chatbots and user assistants and all these things coming together, we should be a lot further along in helping people figure out how to use the freaking software. And you're not going to get any value from software unless people are using it properly. So this is pretty
Totally.
important
Yes, and
stuff.
that's the
Yeah, and we'll be
business
right
value.
back after this break, folks. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, diving into usability of software. Guess what? That matters for every piece of software you've ever found. And anyone who's ever tried to figure out how to do something and done a Google search and then gotten some list of instructions from 4 versions ago knows that it's no fun to do that. But there are other really, really interesting things happening, folks, with these large language models and small language models, foundational models in general, is the fact that some of them can actually analyze code and then give you insights on what that code does. I mean, think about it. You can ask ChatGPT or Gemini, write me some Python code to scrape content from a website, and it'll give you a good bit of code. Usually it's like 80%. The Pareto principle is everywhere. 80% will be correct, and then you got to fine tune to get the last 20%. But that's still pretty good. But my point to James here, Evans of Amplitude, formerly Command AI, is that we should be able to analyze the code and give some deeper insights to not just the users, but maybe even the engineers. So is that something that you guys are working on as well?
Great question. In general, like our shtick is like we want access to anything that can help a user or visitor get more value out of the website or the product or the mobile app, et cetera. We've experimented with code. Um, and what we found so far is, at least with the current kind of crop of foundation models, you don't actually get much benefit from
Hmm.
a answering user questions perspective
Hmm.
that you don't get from, say, help content by adding in code. What you do get, or what you can use the code for, and actually something you brought up earlier, Eric, is kind of bootstrapping. If you don't have any documentation, user-facing documentation, you can actually bootstrap that by handing the code to kind of an AI service and having it generate that first draft. Like I said
Oh, yeah.
earlier, I've found, at least today, I think human written help content tends to be a lot more effective for the job of educating visitors slash customers, but it can still get you a long way. I actually wanted to shout out another company that's doing interesting things in the kind of code understanding space, a company called Dosu, DOSU.dev. Maybe you can have them on. They
Yeah.
are their AI agent is an expert in answering questions about code bases. And you can find them in a lot of like really popular open source repos. Huge issue
Cool.
for a lot of open source communities is contributors, new contributors, like asking questions about how stuff works. And Dosu is a bot that answers those questions. We use it at Command AI. If an engineer has a question like, hey, who wrote this? Like, why does it work this way? Dosu gives the first answer. And
Wow.
it's been a huge kind of productivity unlock because those are questions that typically your best engineers would otherwise be answering.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point because I think a lot of non-coders, and I'm a sort of junior coder, if you will. I've written code in my day. I don't do it for a living anymore. But a lot of people don't realize how structural issues really play into what software can do. And I even asked you at the top of the hour, what was the kernel, right? Because understanding the kernel, what you first
Yep.
tried to build is really important, and then you kind of work around it. In fact, my one of my developer friends has this concept he talks about. He says, anytime you're working in one of these development environments, there's always the thing. And when you draw it like this big diagram, right in the middle is like the thing, and then there's all the stuff that points at the thing and goes
Yeah.
around the thing, and there's the thing of the thing and all this stuff. Use that word, even the thing. And that the point is, you can look at all sorts of lines of code, but that's probably not going to give you the answers that you're looking for because there's a whole architecture here, all sorts of API calls that are being made, different things are happening at different times, and that's getting even more dynamic. I mean, if you look into like a deep learning module, that's incredibly complex stuff, right? I mean, I'm
Totally.
personally a fan of for AI models, the government saying, "Hey guys, you have to make this stuff transparent." Chat,
Yeah, the AI that
ChatGPT,
can explain other AIs is, if you can find someone who's working on that, I'll be very interested.
well, there's a company called Darwin AI. They're up in Canada, Darwin AI. That's their thing is they are an AI that tries to understand what other AIs do,
Oh
right? So
no.
they kind of dig into the weeds. And I guess my point is like it's already so incredibly complicated that even if you did share with them the architecture, it's not like someone can just pick it up and run away with it and do it themselves. I mean, there's just so much effort that goes into this. But the
Totally.
thing is, like ChatGPT is a black box now. So theoretically, it shouldn't have anything to do with giving mortgage loans or healthcare advice or whatever. So it's like, all right, guys, if you would just kind of lower the kimono a bit so we could see, then maybe you could get certified to do these different use cases. But my point to you is that it is very complicated stuff. Like, and how
Totally.
you build out your architecture is a big, big part of the equation of how this thing works, how portable it is, how it will work in new environments. So, but long story short, you're doing very interesting work at that sort of foundational level of helping people understand. And based upon what you told me now, this nudge thing that you have
Mhm.
strikes me as very interesting because and I'm guessing that you offer some of that feedback to the developers too, right? So you could say, hey guys, look, I know you thought that this new module was great, but it looks like
Totally.
people are having a hard time with it. So let's take another look at that. And basically you're part of a broader feedback loop is where I'm going with this, right?
Feedback loop is critical. Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear like survey, they think, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend, this dog
Right.
walking service to a friend or whatever.
Right.
Um, and one of the things that we've encouraged a lot of our customers to do is you can use these in-product nudges to actually capture like much richer feedback. I mentioned
Yeah.
intercepting emotions. There's confusion, but another emotion that we intercept is rage. So you'll get this
Right.
behavior. Maybe you've done it. I've done it. Where it's called a rage click, where users are like, they're just like jamming on the mouse or
Right.
keypad because they're frustrated.
Hilarious.
We can trigger, just a short like technically it's a survey, but it's just like, hey, what's going on? Like, what are you trying to do? Click here to record a message, even, or like take a screenshot of what's going on. And you just fill out like a much richer understanding of what's in the user's head. Because I think fundamentally, like when you have a customer visiting your website, there's so much going on in their head. Their eyes are moving across the page. They've got ideas of like what they think your service or product does, what they want it to achieve, what other similar services they've used in the past are. And if they're sitting behind their laptop, like you don't get any of that. It's happening. Those thoughts exist, but you don't
Right.
get any of it. Imagine they walked into your store. You could see like the reaction to different products. You could ask them questions. We're trying to get a little bit closer to that with nudges so that you can steer them towards a page or feature that seems relevant to them. Or if you're just trying to fill out like what's it, what are those thoughts, like
Right.
capture them without being annoying. We all hate pop-ups. Everyone like
Right.
has the muscle memory to train pop-ups or to
Right.
close pop-ups. And so it's a balancing act between you want to use them to your advantage, but you
Right.
have to respect the user, and that's our big shtick.
No, that this is very interesting because you're giving a window into the user experience that can give direct feedback to developers, to the teams, to improve these products and to get it rolling. Because again, I mean, it's basic stuff, but if people don't know how to use the technology, they're not going to be generating value for themselves
Totally.
or for your business. And that's a real problem. And getting people up to speed, that's always been one of the biggest hurdles in any kind of enterprise software. And, it's funny, I've talked to people at very, very large companies. And one lady even said to me this one time, she goes, "Oh, no, we tried to do that enterprise software stuff and it just didn't work." I'm laughing to myself thinking, this is a really big company that paid probably 6 to 7 figures
Totally.
for some software solution that now they don't even use, and it just
Happens
sits
all the
there,
time. Happens all the
right?
time. And people, they're humans today doing this job of like, customer success, customer support for software. And I don't think those people should go away. But
Right,
you can only interact with your customer. They'll only talk to you over Zoom, you know, so every so often you have to have
right,
like an alternative that's there when the customer wants to use the software. So that's like another way
right,
to think about what we're trying to be. We're trying to be that helpful human that's available like whenever the customer wants to use your thing, as opposed to like
right.
when you've scheduled the check-in call.
Right, and then, of course, you're feeding the developer teams all the time while this is happening. I'm sure there are some variations in how you do that, but the point is then you can be proactive, and I think that's the final comment I'll get from you, is we're enabling people to be proactive is what we're really
Right.
trying to do here, right? We're trying to feed information and gather information such that we don't have to spend time asking dumb questions, right? 1 minute closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. In some ways, I think, people are talking about customized N of one software in the future. Like maybe all software is just going to be a chatbot and it's going to kind of build itself around what I'm trying to do. I think we might
Right,
totally get there, but there's a much more near-term achievable world where software is fully personalized to you. It remembers what you've done. It remembers the words you know, the words you don't know. It has a sense for what you want to do in the software. And that's what we're
right.
trying to build. We're trying to be the personalization layer that when you've got a question, we've got an answer, we can take over the mouse. If you seem like you've gone off track, we can nudge you in the right direction. That's basically the user assistance technology that we're building.
Yeah, and that's great stuff for using technology now, for designing technology in the future. And I think you're right about your predictions here. I just gave a prediction on a keynote the other day about where things are going. It's going to be very, very interesting because intent is not that difficult to ascertain. Intent
Right.
is
You just
pretty
have
easy
to
to
ask.
understand. Right, you ask, or just as you suggest, monitor behavior, like the jamming on the mouse thing. Come on, would you
You
load
learn a lot from
already?
someone jamming on the mouse. That's a very high signal event.
That's a high signal event. I have jammed on the mouse, folks. It is true. I've been like, come on. All right, just close the window. IT crowd. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Folks, what a
That's all our bot
fantastic.
does. It just says close
That's
your
right.
tab and
Turn
we're
it
done.
off and so try it again. All right, folks, look up James Evans now with Amplitude Online. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.